There was an unspoken rule in the galaxy, one that had persisted for generations beyond counting. It was not written into the treaties of the great empires, nor was it etched into the obelisks of wisdom that the oldest civilizations built to pass knowledge to their descendants. It was simply known, a truth so deeply ingrained in the fabric of the galactic consciousness that to question it was to invite disaster. As long as the human is laughing, everything is fine. The ancients had learned this the hard way. They had seen, time and time again, that humans were not like the other species that roamed the stars. They did not take offense easily, nor were they bound by the rigid structures of etiquette that defined interstellar diplomacy. They mocked authority, ridiculed danger, and scoffed at the very idea of caution. Even in the most dire circumstances, when death loomed close and all hope seemed lost, humans would laugh. At first, the elder races had thought it was a sign of weakness. Surely a species that met adversity with jokes and sarcasm was not one to be feared. But then the wars came, and the elders watched. They saw how human soldiers laughed in the trenches, swapping jokes as enemy fire rained down upon them. They witnessed human pilots chuckling over comms as they executed impossible maneuvers that should have left them dead. They listened as human diplomats, insulted and slighted, merely grinned and delivered cutting remarks with a mirth that sent shivers down their opponents' spines. It was only when the laughter stopped that they realized the danger. For when humans ceased to joke, when their ever-present grins faded into grim determination, something changed in them. Their reactions became cold, methodical. Their actions turned swift and merciless. No more warnings, no more chances, no more hesitation. The older civilizations had learned to recognize the shift, the moment when humor turned to silence, the moment when words no longer mattered. They had witnessed it countless times, those laughing soldiers, those joking pilots, those grinning diplomats, and each time, when the laughter stopped, what followed was nothing short of annihilation. If one thought they were dangerous while they laughed, they had no understanding of true terror. For when humans became serious, they did not simply wage war. They became death itself. They passed down their hard-earned knowledge to the younger generations, teaching them that if one ever found themselves facing humans, it was best to hope that they were laughing. Many of the newly ascended species heeded this wisdom. Some were skeptical, but they dared not test it. The stories were too many, the warnings too dire. But as the cycles passed, doubts grew. The young races had never seen the horrors the ancients had witnessed. To them, humans were a known quantity, loud, unruly, prone to sarcasm, but nothing more. And among these rising powers there was one species that stood apart in its ambition: the Nahari. The Nahari were not the only newcomers to the galactic stage, but they were among the most aggressive. Their expansion had been swift, their conquests efficient. They saw themselves as the next great power, destined to surpass the ancient empires and carve their own legacy into the cosmos. To them, the traditions of the old races were nothing but relics of a bygone era, and no tradition seemed more laughable to them than the rule about humans. The Nahari were not fools. They had heard the warnings, studied the records, and listened to the cautionary tales. They had read in the archives how human fleets had once annihilated entire armadas, wiped out enemies so thoroughly that nothing remained but silence and wreckage drifting in the void. The old records spoke of their ruthless efficiency, their cold, unwavering precision, but the only thing they had seen was something else: centuries of peace. Perhaps those were the humans of a different time, a bygone era of war and conquest. The humans they knew were merchants, ambassadors, and explorers. They were loud and irreverent, treating diplomacy with a casual ease that defied the structured formality of the galactic stage. They cracked jokes in tense negotiations, laughed in the presence of threats, and seemed more interested in trade agreements than military campaigns. To them, it was absurd to think that a species that joked so freely, that treated diplomacy with such irreverence, could be anything more than a nuisance. Humans that they saw now were undisciplined, chaotic, soft. A species that laughed in the face of conflict was a species that did not understand conflict. Maybe the archives had exaggerated. Maybe these were not the humans that the old records had warned about, and so the Nahari were ready to put the rule to the test. They would prove the old rule wrong, They would challenge the superstition. The opportunity to test the rule came sooner than expected. A trade negotiation between the Nahari and the Terran Trade Alliance was set to take place on the Nahari homeworld, overseen by representatives from the United Galactic Nations. It was to be a formal affair, one that would unfold over days or even weeks, as each clause, concession, and demand was meticulously debated. Nothing had been finalized, only the broad understanding that an agreement would be reached, one way or another. The Nahari saw themselves as equals in this exchange. Though younger on the galactic stage, their rise had been swift, their ambitions boundless. They had carved their place among the stars through strength and strategy, and they did not come to this table as mere recipients of another empire's largesse. To them, this was not just a trade pact, it was a test of will, a measure of standing. And in their eyes, humanity, though powerful, was still another player in the great game of expansion and influence. The Nahari would negotiate, push, and seek their share, perhaps even more than their share. But the humans had not come here to prove themselves. That phase of their history was long past. They had already built the lanes of commerce that bound the galaxy together, secured the treaties that defined entire economies, and mastered the unseen mechanisms that kept the balance of power in check. They had fought their wars, paid their toll in blood and sacrifice, and emerged as a species that no longer sought a place in the order of things. They were the order. The Nahari did not yet understand that, and so they prepared. Their first move was subtle, almost dismissible. The human delegation's landing site was altered. A minor adjustment to the gravitational dampeners, a slight destabilization of the platform. Nothing catastrophic, nothing that would raise alarms, just enough to ensure that the human vessel would experience a rough landing. They wanted to see if irritation would begin to crack the human facade. As the Terran diplomatic vessel entered the atmosphere, it was clear to observers that something was off. The ship wobbled slightly as it approached the designated pad, thrusters flaring harder than necessary. The stabilizers struggled for a breath of a second before compensating, but not before the craft hit the platform with a force just sharp enough to send a noticeable jolt through the hull. Under normal circumstances, a delegation might have taken offense. A diplomatic envoy was supposed to be welcomed with precision and care, not with a barely stable descent. The Nahari delegation watched carefully as the humans disembarked, scanning their expressions, their body language, waiting for the first signs of irritation. Instead, they got laughter. One of the human delegates rolled their shoulders with a grin. "Well, I think that just cured my backache." Another chuckled as they stepped down. "Best landing I've had all week. We should make this a regular thing." A third casually stretched, letting out an exaggerated sigh. "You know, you guys might be onto something. I'll have to recommend this to our engineers. We'll call it therapeutic turbulence." A ripple of chuckles passed through the human group, their ease entirely unshaken. The Nahari officials exchanged brief glances. So far, the rule remained unbroken, but this was only the beginning. The Nahari were patient. The first provocation had been subtle, and though it had failed to elicit the reaction they hoped for, they remained committed to their test. If a rough landing was not enough to crack the humans' good humor, then the next insult would be more direct. The negotiations began with formal introductions. Representatives of various species were present, their names spoken with careful precision by the UGN mediator. The Nahari, however, had their own approach. When it was time to introduce the human delegation, the lead Nahari speaker, a tall, violet-skinned official named Varric, stood before the gathered diplomats and, with great deliberation, butchered their names. "From the Terran delegation, we welcome Ambassador Grugaden and his aides, Harold Station and Jay Quallen." The room went silent for a moment. The humans, seated in their designated area, exchanged glances. The ambassador in question, Gregory Dunn, arched an eyebrow, suppressing an amused smirk. His aides, Harold Stinson and Jacqueline, visibly tensed, but only for a fraction of a second. Varric continued, feigning politeness. "I beg your pardon if I pronounce those incorrectly?" The insult was clear. The Nahari had no difficulty pronouncing the names of the other species in attendance. They had spoken even the most complex, syllable-laden dignitaries' names with perfect clarity. But with the humans, they had deliberately mispronounced them in a way that was not only wrong but absurdly exaggerated. It was a calculated jab, one that under normal circumstances might have been met with offence or a stiff diplomatic correction. The Nahari delegation watched, waiting. Then, to their surprise, Gregory Dunn leaned back in his chair, a slow grin spreading across his face. "Well," he said, scratching his chin, "that's new. I don't think I've ever been called Grugurden before." Harold let out a short laugh. "I like it. Sounds like some kind of legendary warrior, and it's better than a station." Jacqueline, without missing a beat, gasped theatrically, "Oh no! Are we being renamed? Sir Grugurden, protect me!" The humans burst into laughter. Gregory turned to the UGN mediator, grinning. "I mean, if this is an official diplomatic rebranding, I'll need to update my business cards. Grugurden, Supreme Negotiator of Earth. Has a nice ring to it." More chuckles followed. Even a few of the other diplomats present, unfamiliar with the full context, found themselves amused by the humans' reaction. Varek's expression remained neutral, but his fingers twitched slightly in irritation. He had expected something, perhaps mild annoyance, a subtle glare, maybe even a stiff correction. Instead, the humans had taken the insult and turned it into a joke at their own expense, making it even more ridiculous than he had intended. Still, the Nahari were not finished. If direct disrespect would not shake them, perhaps discomfort would. The human delegation had been assigned accommodations on the Nahari homeworld, as was customary for visiting dignitaries. Hospitality, even in diplomacy, was a delicate matter. Traditionally, a host species ensured that their guests were given comfortable quarters suited to their physiological needs. The UGN had standard protocols for such arrangements, ensuring that every species, no matter how different, was housed in a way that met their environmental requirements. But the Nahari had arranged something different. The human quarters were just within acceptable limits. The temperature was slightly too high for human comfort, nothing unbearable, but enough to be mildly irritating. The beds were shorter than standard human proportions, forcing them to either curl up awkwardly or let their feet hang off the edge. The lighting was dim, straining to human eyes but perfectly suited to Nahari vision. The ventilation was sluggish, making the air feel faintly stale. It was not outright hostility, not something that could be called sabotage, but it was just uncomfortable enough to be a constant, grating presence. The Nahari, watching closely, waited to see if the humans would finally show signs of displeasure. They did not. Instead, the humans once again made light of the situation. Gregory Dunn sighed dramatically. "Ah, finally! A bed designed for maximum discomfort. You know, I think my spine just reinvented itself." Harold, remarking on the dim lighting, chuckled. "This is great. I've always wanted to live in a haunted house." Jacqueline smirked. "Think we can get a marketing deal out of this? Nahari sleep experience for those who hate comfort." Even at the negotiation table the next day, Gregory casually joked about it. "I have to thank our hosts," he said with an easy smile. "Your accommodations have given me a deep appreciation for human adaptability. I think I've unlocked a new sleep technique, extreme diplomatic survival mode. More laughter, more ease." The Nahari, watching, felt their certainty harden. This was not the reaction of a proud or dangerous species. Real warriors would not endure insult after insult with nothing but jokes and forced smiles. They would not laugh in the face of disrespect. They would demand honor, push back, prove their strength. But these humans? They deflected. They brushed everything aside, pretending not to notice the slights. It was pathetic. As the negotiations progressed, the Nahari began to notice something peculiar. Humans were easygoing. Concessions that should have been fiercely debated were granted with little resistance. Points that other species would have fought over for weeks were met with little more than a shrug and a nod. The humans agreed to many of the Nahari's terms with an almost casual indifference, as though they did not see the need to extract every ounce of advantage from the deal. For humanity, this was not a game of dominance. Trade was not war, nor was it a contest of wills. It was an investment, an opportunity for a younger species to grow, to stand on firmer ground, to take their first steps towards something greater. Humanity had been here before, centuries ago, when they were the ones clawing their way to relevance. They had fought and bled for every inch of their place in the stars, and now, standing as one of the great powers of the galaxy, they had no need to strangle lesser species in negotiations. So they let the Nahari have their victories. They allowed them their bargaining triumphs. They were, in every sense, the bigger man. But the Nahari misunderstood. They saw leniency as weakness. They mistook generosity for hesitation, patience for a lack of resolve. In their eyes, the humans were yielding because they had to, because they lacked the will to contest the Nahari's growing strength. With each agreement tilted in their favor, with each point that fell to them without a fight, their confidence swelled. The old stories had to be exaggerations, relics of a past long buried. The terrifying, relentless force that had once shaken the stars, if it had ever truly existed, was long gone. All that remained were soft diplomats too spineless to stand up for themselves. Humans were all bark, no bite. They had misread the humans. And there was a lesson the galaxy had long since learned. The most dangerous mistake one could make was to believe that humanity's kindness was theirs to exploit. The signing hall was a testament to Nahari grandeur. Tall, arched ceilings lined with intricate carvings, banners of various interstellar nations draped in perfect symmetry, and a long obsidian table at the center, polished to a mirror sheen. The atmosphere was ceremonial, dignified. Treaties lay before the delegates, each document a product of weeks of negotiation, each word carrying the weight of future alliances. The Nahari delegation sat with quiet confidence, their posture relaxed, their expressions smug beneath the veneer of formality. They had tested the humans time and time again, and each time they had found them lacking. Humans were, at best, skilled at masking their discomfort. At worst, they were exactly as the Nahari had begun to suspect, weak, spineless, undeserving of their reputation. And so, as was tradition in Nahari diplomacy, the final signing of the negotiation called for a parting remark. Not a test, but a statement made in arrogance and certainty, a final twist of the blade, delivered under the assumption that the humans would not dare to object. High Chancellor Verka rose from his seat, his sharp eyes gleaming with carefully contained amusement. He offered a smile, polite, practiced, insincere. "It is truly remarkable how your species honors those who fall in battle," he began, his voice smooth, his tone almost reverent. "Captain Elias Rourke, was it not? A man who gave his life in service of your people? A noble sacrifice indeed." He paused, letting the words settle, ensuring that every ear in the hall was attuned to his voice. Then, with the softest tilt of his head, he delivered the knife's edge. "It must take a unique kind of courage to embrace the inevitability of failure so readily, to recognize when there is no point in further resistance and simply accept fate. A wisdom, I think, that not all species possess." Then, with a measured nod, he added, "Perhaps that is humanity's greatest strength, knowing when to kneel." The words dripped with careful condescension, wrapped in just enough false admiration to be excused as a genuine observation. To the uninformed, it might have sounded like praise. But the gathered dignitaries, every species well versed in the intricacies of diplomatic language, heard the truth beneath the pleasantries. It was no tribute. It was an insult disguised in civility, a masterful twisting of words designed to undermine the very core of human resilience. The suggestion was clear. Captain Rourke had not died a warrior's death. He had not fought to the bitter end. He had surrendered to the inevitable, yielding in the face of superior force. The implication extended beyond the fallen captain. This was what humans did. They knew when they were beaten. They did not rage against the dying light. They simply let it consume them. For the first time, there was no laughter. Gregory Dunn did not smile. Harold, who had chuckled through every slight before this, was silent. Jacqueline's usual smirk was gone, her fingers tightening ever so slightly against the edge of the treaty before her. The Nahari delegate allowed himself a small flicker of satisfaction as he watched the human's ever-present grin falter. Finally, after all their taunts had gone unanswered, after all their jabs had been deflected with humor, they had stopped laughing. It was a victory, small but significant. But as he turned his gaze to the other alien delegates, expecting to find them sharing in his triumph, he found something else entirely. Dread, not for the humans, for him. Expressions were tense, rigid. Some had gone utterly still, others averted their gazes as if unwilling to witness what came next. A few sat stiff-backed, their eyes filled with something close to pity. And in that moment, a whisper of unease curled in his gut. Something was wrong. Terribly, terribly wrong. The humans had endured every previous slight, had brushed off every attempt to provoke them with humour, with ease. But now, the room had never been so quiet. Every being present, every diplomat, every observer, every alien who had spent even a passing moment studying human history, knew the name Captain Elias Rourke. To speak of him was to invoke a legend, a name etched into the annals of interstellar history not just by humans but by many species who had benefited from his actions. He was not merely a human hero, he was a symbol of defiance, of unyielding courage in the face of impossible odds. A century ago, during the Vulcan raid, it was his bravery that had turned certain annihilation into salvation. The mining colony on Vulcan had been prosperous but vulnerable, a rich prize for raiders who thrived in lawless space. When the pirates came, they came with overwhelming force, striking with brutal efficiency, slaughtering those who resisted, and seizing control before a proper defense could be mustered. Resistance was crushed swiftly, and the fate of the colony seemed sealed. By the time Captain Rourke's vessel, the Indomitable, arrived, the battle had already been lost. The pirates had taken the surface, secured their hold, and begun executing those who dared to defy them. Escape was nearly impossible. Reinforcements were too far away. The logical choice, the sensible choice, would have been to retreat, to regroup, to accept that Vulcan had fallen. But Rourke did not retreat. With nothing but a battered fleet and a handful of desperate allies, he launched an attack not to reclaim the colony, not to win an impossible war, but to buy time, to save as many lives as he could before the inevitable end. His ship, outgunned and outmatched, fought with a ferocity that should not have been possible. He threw every ounce of strategy, every reckless maneuver, every last gambit into the fight. He gave the miners, the civilians, the scattered defenders a chance to escape, while he and his crew held the line against insurmountable odds. It was a battle that no sane tactician would have waged, a final stand with no expectation of survival. And yet, because of him, thousands who would have perished made it to safety. Humans, aliens, families, children, the forgotten and the overlooked. Captain Elias Rourke and his brave soldiers had died on that battlefield, not as men who accepted fate, but as warriors who defied it to the very last breath. His ship had gone down in flames, his final act ensuring that the refugees had enough time to flee beyond the reach of the raiders. And now, in this chamber of polished stone and calculated words, the Nahari had dared to twist that legacy into something lesser. The humans were silent. Not a single word passed between them, not a flicker of amusement or irritation. Their faces were unreadable, their gazes fixed and unblinking. The Nahari had expected a reaction, perhaps another joke, another instance of that infuriating human levity. They had spent weeks pushing, needling, escalating, convinced that humans either did not understand the slights or were too weak to respond to them. But now, as they sat beneath the cold, steady stare of the human delegation, they felt something shift. The air in the chamber grew heavier, though nothing had changed. The same dim lighting, the same elegant carvings along the walls, the same polished surface of the long negotiation table. And yet there was a weight to the silence now, something oppressive, something unseen but undeniable. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Gregory spoke. "Perhaps," he said, his voice calm, deliberate, firm, "you would like to revisit history." His tone was not confrontational, not overtly aggressive, but there was a quality to it that made the words feel like an undeniable command. The Nahari ambassador stiffened slightly, but forced an easy expression. "History," he repeated, feigning polite curiosity. "We are well versed in. Perhaps you have not read the aftermath of the Vulcan attack," the human continued, cutting through the Nahari's words as if they were insignificant. He did not raise his voice, but it carried through the chamber with an undeniable presence. "The story most remember is that of Captain Elias Rourke, his sacrifice, his heroism. But there is another story, one that comes after, one that is often overshadowed by Rourke's final stand." The Nahari delegation exchanged glances. They had studied human history, of course. They had read of Rourke's sacrifice, had analysed the strategies, had assessed the logistics of the battle. But the human's words suggested something more. A faint ripple of unease passed through the room. The Nahari ambassador, ever composed, tilted his head slightly. "Oh? And what story is that?" Gregory's lips curved, not into a smile, but into something far more unsettling, a predator's expression. "Let me recall history for you," he said, voice steady, gaze unwavering. He leaned forward slightly, placing his hands on the table, fingers splayed. The motion was slow, deliberate. Around him his fellow humans remained still, their faces impassive, their silence absolute. The Nahari were beginning to feel it now, that creeping, unsettling sensation that something was wrong. "Tell me, Ambassador," he said, his voice smooth, measured. "Have you ever wondered about the attack on Virkon?" The Nahari ambassador blinked, thrown by the question's simplicity. Gregory continued, his tone deceptively casual. "Such a large mining colony, so well established, to mount an assault of such scale on such a place, well, that isn't something a few desperate marauders could pull off, is it?" He let the question hang. The Nahari delegation exchanged brief glances. It was an obvious statement, one they had never considered deeply. "Whoever led that assault," Gregory mused, his voice lowering just slightly, "must have been more than just pirates. They had to be powerful, dangerous, a force to be reckoned with." He tilted his head slightly. Surely a name like that wouldn't have simply gone unnoticed. Gregory let him dwell on it. "You must have heard of them," he said, softer now, like he was coaxing the realization to the surface. The Nahari ambassador frowned, his mind grasping at the details he had once skimmed over. The name had been there, buried in the records, an afterthought in the grander analysis of the battle. He had read it, but he had never paid it any mind. "The attackers at Virkon," the human continued, his voice carrying an almost eerie certainty, "were the Krillians." The name fell into the room like a stone into still water. The Nahari ambassador frowned slightly. The word was familiar, but only faintly so. He had seen it before, buried in some old text, referenced in passing. But there was no such pirate group known as the Krillians now. No faction, no remnant, no records of active operations. He hesitated. "I am not familiar with that name." The human's eyes locked onto his. "Exactly." The single word sent an almost imperceptible shudder through the Nahari delegation. Exactly. It was not an explanation, nor a correction. It was a statement, a confirmation of absence. A name that should have belonged to a pirate horde, one of the many groups that roamed the lawless reaches of space. A name that pulled such massive-scale piracy should have persisted, as all such factions did, through raids and skirmishes, losses and victories. But it hadn't. The Nahari ambassador's throat felt dry. "There is no such pirate group known as the Krillians," he said, almost uncertainly, as if testing the statement aloud. Across from him, the human ambassador did not blink. "Exactly," he repeated. It was then that the realization fully settled. The Krillians did not disappear. They did not fade into obscurity. They did not splinter into smaller factions or retreat into the depths of uncharted space. They were gone, utterly, entirely gone. The implications slammed into the Nahari with the force of a collapsing star. The Krillians, who had razed Virkon, who had butchered civilians, who had slaughtered prisoners, had not simply been defeated. They had been erased. And that silence, that absence, that lack of records was not an accident. The humans had wiped them from existence. Every last one. There was no surviving remnant, no drifting survivors nursing old grudges, no scattered remnants licking their wounds in some forgotten system. There was only silence, a void where an entire faction had once been. The realization sent a chill down the Nahari's spines. The Nahari delegate, once so sure of his own wit, now felt the crushing weight of realization settle upon him. He had silenced the human's laughter, and in doing so, he had ripped away the veil that hid what lay beneath. For humanity did not rise through conquest alone. They did not claim their place among the stars through diplomacy or trade. They rose through loss, through pain, through sacrifice, through the blood of their martyrs and the ashes of their dead. They laughed to hide it, to bury the ghosts beneath grins and jests, to keep the weight of their own history from consuming them. But when the laughter stops, all that remains is the other side of humanity, the pain, and they will not hesitate to share it with you. The Krillians had been powerful. They had ruled the lawless reaches of space with brutality, striking fear into the hearts of those who crossed their path. They were not a minor nuisance or a ragtag band of marauders. They were a force. And yet the humans had destroyed them so thoroughly that the Nahari, who prided themselves on knowing the movements of all interstellar factions, had barely even heard of them. The humans had not merely avenged Captain Rourke. They had not sought justice. They had annihilated the enemy so completely that centuries later their name barely existed. The Nahari ambassador felt the weight of 1,000 unspoken truths pressing down on him. The humans had not forgotten the sacrifice. They had not brushed aside the memory of their fallen hero. They had not moved on. They had exacted vengeance. They had erased their enemy with the same calm, deliberate efficiency with which their ambassador now spoke. For the first time in the entirety of these negotiations, the Nahari felt their gut twisting in fear. The Nahari ambassador's breath felt shallow as he cast a quick glance around the room. Everywhere he looked, the faces of the other alien delegates were carved with the same expression, an unmistakable blend of shock, horror, and grim understanding. No one spoke. No one moved. But their eyes said everything. "Nahari, you fool. You made a grave mistake." Their mandibles twitched. Their feathers ruffled, their tendrils coiled ever so slightly, subtle, instinctive signs of unease. The room was no longer merely silent. It was suffocating. The Nahari ambassador swallowed, suddenly keenly aware of just how small his delegation felt in that moment. The humans stood, chairs scraping against the polished floor as they rose in unison. The Terran ambassador's voice was steady, final. "We will meet again in 2 days." Gregory's tone was ironclad. It was not a suggestion, not a request, a command. And with that, the humans left, their departure heavier than any spoken threat. 2 days later, when the delegates reconvened, the air was thick with unease. The Nahari knew something had changed, though they clung to the hope that all could be mended. That hope shattered the moment the humans placed the new treaty on the table. Gone were the leniencies. Gone were the provisions that would have fueled the Nahari's expansion. The revised terms were cold, merciless in their fairness, stripping them of every advantage they had once been offered. The treaty was not retaliation, it was a lesson. The Nahari delegate let out a weak protest. "This is not fair." A single strained sentence filled with guilt and dawning regret. The human ambassador Gregory met his gaze, his expression unreadable. Then he spoke. "This treaty was meant to help you grow, to give you a place among the stars. But you wielded your arrogance like a blade and severed your own path. We saw through your insults, the deliberate landing mishaps, the rooms designed to discomfort, the mispronounced names." He let the silence stretch before continuing. "We ignored them because they were petty." He leaned forward slightly, his voice lowering, sharpening. "But you crossed a line when you mocked our sacrifice. That we do not forget." The Nahari delegate shrank in his seat. "You think you're playing a game." The human's voice was deceptively calm, the weight behind it suffocating. Then, after a pause, he continued, his words slow and deliberate. "We play until there is no one left to challenge us." The silence that followed was unbearable. "You do not understand humanity. You see us laughing, easygoing, and mistake it for weakness. You see us sharing knowledge and assume we are naive. You are but a flickering flame, fleeting and fragile. We are the fire that has raged for millennia, tempered by the storms of war, fed by the sacrifices of those who came before. You sought to test us, to provoke us, without ever realizing that you stand in the shadow of an inferno." His voice remained steady, but the weight behind it was absolute. "We are not warlords who crush lesser beings out of wounded pride. If we were, your homeworld would be burning by now. No, war has already taught us the value of life, the weight of loss. We do not retaliate in anger." His eyes hardened. "We teach." The words echoed in the silent chamber, final and absolute, and in that moment the Nahari understood. They had not just offended a people, they had disturbed the foundation upon which humanity was built, and they were paying the price. The ink dried, sealing the Nahari's fate with a final unceremonious stroke. The meeting ended. The humans did not linger, they did not gloat, they did not offer any parting words of reassurance or spite. They simply stood, turned, and left the grand hall in silence. And in that silence, the weight of what had just transpired settled upon the room like a heavy fog. The Nahari delegation sat frozen, their arrogance now replaced with something else entirely, a cold, creeping realization of the power they had so carelessly provoked. The other species in attendance, many of them young and untested in the ways of interstellar politics, had watched the events unfold with rapt attention. Some had doubted the old warnings about humanity, others had dismissed them as myths, relics of a bygone era when war shaped the stars. Now they understood. As long as the human is laughing, everything is fine. Humans did not conquer through brute force alone. They did not need to raise weapons to break an enemy. Their patience was a weapon, their restraint a warning, their silence a sentence, their laughter a mask. They had offered the Nahari a future paved with prosperity, and the Nahari had repaid them with scorn. And so the humans had simply taken it away. It was never about war. There was no need for bloodshed, for it was not humanity's laughter that made them dangerous. It was what remained when the laughter was gone.